I asked Hugh what was the first activity he did, the first thing he organised. And he was saying that when he was at school, they decided to set up a bike cleaning and fixing business. So they worked on this bike and they made it look fantastic, and then they put out the brochure. And they said, for £1, we'll fix and clean your bike. And I think they kind of underpriced it a little bit, because the next morning there were 200 bikes lined up for this little crew to work on. Would you please give a warm welcome to Hugh?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I certainly learnt about getting my pricing right. So, day two. There are advantages and disadvantages, of course, of speaking on day two. It was great to, feel the conference. But, of course, I was really impressed by the speakers yesterday. They set the bar really high. Indeed, even before yesterday, the welcome, the porphyry from Papa Fred was fantastic. These people really get place. They really get caring long-term about place. And I think that that's a major constituent of what we're talking about. But, what an impressive start there was to the conference. I think I got something from everybody. And Tony's left foot, right foot. In the UK, the financial year for many third sector organisations runs from April to March. So just before I left, I'd been doing an awful lot of budget setting for people. And it is such a left foot, right foot situation. I've said the main thing, whatever you set your budget, is that you have to be quick on your feet at the moment. And then Len, I mean, a mayor who talks about triple bottom line investment. I can't think of a local authority leader in the UK from whom I've ever heard those words. And the guy sings as well. I promise you I'm not going to sing. I used to use it as a way of keeping my daughters quiet. I would threaten to sing. And then two hugely powerful presentations, I thought. And Narimu really blew me away. I thought the quiet dignity with which he presented the case, clearly backed up with detailed research and understanding, was a fantastic message. The stuff about cultural genocide, for me it was that no marae, no meeting place. This is essential. In a world where we are increasingly interdependent, we need meeting places. I'll talk a bit later about the meeting places I've tried to build in my own home community in Bradford. Connell, I'm more familiar, sadly and joyously both, with the story from Derry. Competition has brought us misery. Cooperation is the way forward. Adversity very often being the stimulus for great things, and Cregan Enterprises is a wonderful story. There's another link for me with Derry. The life president of the Development Trust Association is a man called Paddy Doherty, who established the Inner City Trust in Derry. Now, there are all kinds of apocryphal stories about Paddy, including the fact that he used his friendship with the Republican side to blow up certain buildings that were in his way for the regeneration of Derry. Now, I'm sure there's no truth in that. Paddy told me, Paddy's a very old man now, but a wonderful man, and told me a beautiful story, and this is the only definition that I will provide you of social enterprise. He said when he was a young boy, his mother said, would you go outside and chop some wood up? We're getting low on wood for the fire in the winter. And he grumbled about this a bit, obviously didn't want to go out in the cold. And she said, get on with you. It's good work. It warms you twice. And I think there's a lot about social enterprise that we need to create business models that warm us twice. And then Steve, I loved Steve's stuff. Certainly one of the things that I really loved about yesterday was that I really do feel that we are all beginning to talk a common language. And I think that's incredibly important. If we can't, in this room, talk a common language, how the hell can we promote it more widely? But the particular things, I suppose, I drew from Steve was every citizen needs to be a change maker. Shonky, I love Shonky. I was using it in my workshop yesterday. But also his real emphasis, this is a team game. Cooperation is a team game. We need to work with government. We need to work with business. Apart from some things that I'll say about the very hot money in the banking system, I think that we need to stretch out those alliances. And then Ingrid, when, towards the end of the day, I really felt, well, Ingrid said so much better so many of the things that I thought I was going to say today. And it is fantastic in that sense to find that we have a real common language, particularly around social investment, which is my preferred things. I loved her curves. That's not supposed to be a sexist remark. I'm talking about her business journey, and I always think that investors really get it if they understand that it is that very squiggly journey that she showed on her last slide. Dequity is, I'm not sure if it's a very pleasant sounding word, but I get it absolutely, and it's the field in which I've been working for the last 10, 15 years. And also the importance of high-touch relationships in terms of getting social investment right. I think that's really important. I don't want to go on too long. Obviously, we heard at dinner last night from the Minister and from Jenny. I think you're really lucky that you have people in those positions who really come from here and really get it. So, I've lost the thing. Okay, the clicker. I call my talk a campsite in a Gale, and I'm delighted to be here following Anne-Marie and Jess, who came out from the Development Trust Association last year. We've been rebranded. I've been rebranded. It's a consequence of a historic merger, really, between two networks of community enterprises in the UK. Both got reduced to acronyms. So the one I was with for many years now was the Development Trust Association, a network of community enterprises. And the other one was BASAC, which is even more of a mouthful, the British Association of Settlements and Social Action Centres. In spite of the lousy name, they have an impeccable pedigree. BASAC grew out of a movement in the 1890s of the beginning of the labour movement, the beginning of thinking about the welfare state and that kind of thing, and was a bunch of undergraduates from Oxford and Cambridge universities planting long-term settlements in the poor East End, and understanding that change in poor communities takes a long time, and therefore they needed to plant permanent settlements there that would really understand the problems and begin to tackle them slowly. So I feel that the DTA has picked up 100 years of really impressive history through this merger, and I'm absolutely delighted. It was a long time coming. We've been talking about it for 10 years. We bought a building together in central London about 5 years ago, and the merger itself, once we decided to go for it, took an awful long time. Merging value-based organisations is a very difficult thing to do. As you would expect, we're now offering consultancy advice around how organisations should merge in the spirit of enterprise. Stuff on us. We've reconfigured around 3 main work streams: assets, enterprise, and social action. Unfortunately, our merger has coincided with very tough times in the UK for the third sector, and has become a bit conflated together. Our combined staff was 85. We've had to reduce to 50 staff. So that has been quite a painful process over the winter. So 3 main work streams: assets, enterprise, and social action. And our work is really focused on working with members, because that's what keeps us real, what's possible, what works. And our main way of promoting learning is through peer-to-peer networking. Indeed, we always try and have a pot of money called a knowledge and skills exchange, and I was suggesting to Di that perhaps a similar thing would be useful out here, that pays the expenses of groups visiting other projects, but also pays the projects who are hosting for their time. So there's a real recognition that this is a value transaction. Our members work in areas of market failure, usually where the private sector has withdrawn and the public sector has underinvested or somehow is not managing to deliver effectively. Often in communities where I describe it as the fabric of society is very threadbare, or indeed sometimes broken altogether. But importantly, and I think this is the sort of first important point I want to make to us, is I don't really buy into perpetual growth economics. So I don't necessarily assume that things will always get better. Very often, I think we need to frame the conversation in terms of, unless we invest in these things, they will come back to haunt us later and later, over generations. There was a wonderful, very pro-social enterprise chief exec of Sheffield City Council in Yorkshire. He's now permanent undersecretary in the Department of Communities and Local Government, a guy called Bob Kerslake. He had a map of Sheffield on the wall, tracking indices of deprivation, both up to date, but he also found one from 100 years ago. The communities mapped exactly on each other. So we're not talking about quick fix here. The costs of doing nothing, particularly in the kind of societies like UK and New Zealand where there is a welfare state, are profound, and we need to understand that equation. So back to the curves again. Anybody who produces me a straight line saying we're going this way and here's the outcomes, I say I don't believe it. And clearly there are all kinds of reasons why, therefore, we need to think about, as I say, the costs of doing nothing. A bit more about locality. So sorry, I've got too many slides. I'm going to click through fairly quickly. Just something about size, 600 members UK-wide, total income, earned income. So you see that although we're committed to enterprise, it's only just under 50% of the income is generated by trading. So still heavily dependent on a cocktail of funding. Assets in community ownership, goodness knows whether that was a pre or post-crash valuation, numbers of staff employed, etc. I'm going to go back on it. Okay. I've called this talk a campsite in a gale because in the scheme of things, community enterprise still remains small. It often seems that the major forces at work make a mockery of our work. But I want to try and sketch out a message of common sense and sanity. I can't resist talking a bit more about the Gale. I have a confession to make. I have a dark past. I spent the 1980s working in the City of London as an investment banker. For many years, I've been saying this to people in the third sector, and pre-crash, people didn't quite understand what I meant. There seemed to be something incredibly sexy about all this money, and everything was getting better and better, and everyone was looking at the investment banking world as if it was a huge phenomenon. Now, and I'm glad of your reaction, you get what I mean. But I do think that the context in which thinking about money, which I will get to eventually, is set by the mainstream commercial markets. And I believe that we've got that profoundly wrong. It is a time of great change, it seems, and other people refer to this, both natural events, war in the Mediterranean. I was appalled to hear this morning that the British are sending in troops to, or not troops, officers to advise into Libya. The black swan events that they talk about in the financial market seems to be coming thick and fast. We certainly haven't seen the end of the financial crisis in Europe. It's posing huge strains on a number of economies. And it's not clear to me what the outcome's going to be. I suppose I saw at first hand in the 80s the power of the combination of global communications, hugely powerful computers, and saw that we were going to see this wave of the financialization, it's not a very pretty word, but I think you understand what I mean, of nearly everything. That we've turned everything into money value. I believe that profoundly, essentially, in the end, I was trying to explain what I did to people, did in the city. And one of my oldest friends sort of said to me, so you're just making money out of money, really? And of course, you can't do that. So I knew that I was getting one of those telephone number salaries. I wasn't adding any value. And therefore I must be stealing from somebody. And I believe that that situation has got worse geometrically since I was there. Finance, I think we need to get back to some really fundamental principles about the use of money. Firstly, money is a contract. It's a contract that we invented, or at least I think the Babylonians or somebody invented it, didn't they? Clearly, it is a very useful device for us all to buy into as a society. But it needs to be seen for what it is. Fundamentally, it is a universally agreed confidence trick. I believe that money has three core functions: a means of exchange, an expression of relative value, and some people would argue that it is also useful as a store of wealth. Our ancestors had a very healthy suspicion of it as a store of wealth. The recipe was, you have big families, you buy loads of things, lands and assets, and if you have any spare cash, perhaps you hand it over to those shysters who promise that they'll give it back to you at some future date with a specific value. I think that we've lost control of the financial system across the world. I think that there is too much hot money that has no loyalty, no morality, that is chasing around. It is like, for me, I think of the films, The Seven Samurai and The Magnificent Seven. It's like the bandits who come at harvest time and steal the surplus. And this has happened massively. And I think that there has been some recognition. If you read the Joint Congressional Report on the financial crisis in the States, they say very clearly that this is effectively a massive robbery. I'm afraid the robbery's taken place, the money's gone, and we have to suffer with the consequences. The hedge fund industry in the US is bigger than the banking industry. So it's not just going to be sufficient to regulate the banking industry. We need to regulate the shadow banking industry as well. One bank in America, the Wauchover, has allegedly processed $386 billion of drug money. That money goes into the hot money system, the bandits that rove the world, distorting value and adjusting to it. Unfortunately, some of our conventional financial managers, the pension funds, have got involved in that. So you get pension funds investing in the hot money industry through the hedge funds, and then lending them their shares so that the hedge funds can short the portfolios that the pension fund owns. I mean, we have absolute mad financial systems. New Zealand has seen the consequences of this. I did a little bit of research. Here's just a simple graph of the volatility of Kiwi dollar against the US dollar. But the Kiwi dollar is the 12th most traded currency in the world. With all due respect, New Zealand is a very important country, but that 4 million of you, your currency is the 12th most traded in the world. So you are as exposed, if not more exposed, than any country in the world to this mad Gale. So, that's pretty much, I guess, the end of my rant. I just needed to get that out of my system. And now I'll try and get on to a bit about social finance and the space that I've been working in for a number of years. I left the city in 1987. I packed up and followed my wife's career up to Bradford in the north of England, in Yorkshire, a very poor city, a former wool textile city. Most of the textile industry, as a mature technology, had flown overseas to cheaper labour countries. And Bradford, like so many of the great northern cities in the UK, is struggling to reinvent itself in the global economy. I'll be talking, try and take an overview of the social finance market. It's a little bit difficult because I've been involved directly with establishing a number of funds. So I want to talk about Key Fund, which is a risk capital fund in the north of England, the Adventure Capital Fund, now rebranded as the Social Investment Business, and a little bit, sorry to those of you who came to my workshop, about community shares, because I think the balance between debt and equity is really important. Just start with some numbers about the state of social lending in the UK. The CDFA, the Community Development Finance Association, is the network organisation of most of the social finance institutions in the UK. Their latest figures are available for 09-010, and as you see, in the wake really of the withdrawal of the commercial banking system from the social finance sector. So what we saw in the run-up to 2007 was actually the commercial banks were engaging and in some cases undercutting the specialist financial institutions in terms of offering lending to the third sector, often offering too much debt in my view, and that has come back to haunt them. But after 2007, almost a lending strike, and not just across the social enterprise sector, but across the SME sector, because they needed to capitalize, and they still wanted to use most of their capital in the casino, because that's where they perceived greatest value. As you can see, some fairly healthy growth in numbers. It gives you a rough idea of the size of the thing. Just before I left UK, I was delighted to hear that the CDFA, bidding on behalf of a whole group of community development finance institutions, was awarded a £60 million package from the Regional Growth Fund, which is one of our new coalitions, very modest counters to the savage cuts that they're putting in to most of their spending. That £60 million was £30 million in grant and £30 million in commercial funding, and will flow through the social investment institutions across the country. So there is growth across the UK in terms of social investment. Again, I think we need to be clear about what money's for, and I was very impressed by Ingrid yesterday talking about right capital, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I do quite a lot of investment readiness talking and training in the UK, and I think one of the difficulties of the conventional banking sector is that things are so complicated. None of us really understand or are able to compare like with like. There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of different products out there. And in order to keep it simple, sorry, that's not the slide I expected. Okay. We need to understand what kind of money is right for which stage of growth. And this mirrors one of Ingrid's slides yesterday. So it's talking about the journey, the development journey, and inevitably, as you move up the curve, there is more money available for secured loans, for established companies, and the problem, the little supply problem, is really at the risky start end, the development capital end, and that's the toughest place to find it. So this is a slide from my investment readiness presentation, and I really think there are only 3 stages of money that we need to think about, and I always try and keep it as simple as possible, and if you can benchmark your journey against this simple model. So there's the development finance, grow, change or die money is what I call it. I went to a very influential conference in Chicago in 2004, the week that Obama was re-elected as Senator for Illinois. It was a very exciting week, and I learned a fantastic amount there. And the conference was called Grow, Change or Die. And I've picked it up as a bit of a mantra. It seems to me we live in a changing world, and organisations need to be thinking about that all the time. But that is your early stage, it's your research and development, it's your future planning. Usually covered by a lot of sweat equity, and indeed as an investor, as Sue was saying yesterday in her workshop, you're very lucky to have Sue in New Zealand. She's a great social banker coming from one of the leading experience with Triodos. We respect Triodos. We look up to them as one of the market leaders. Unless you have a lot of sweat equity in an investment proposition, it probably isn't right. And then clearly there is stuff around capital. I know Anne-Marie talked to you about assets. I really believe in terms of building balance sheet that assets is the way to go. I hope that some of our experience around promoting asset transfer that I'll talk a bit more about will get picked up seriously here. And then you need working capital, clearly not to be mistaken for holes in your budget. Okay. So story time, getting the gearing right, getting the proportion of risk capital and debt finance into your business model is really important. This is a picture of the group in Hudswell, a village in North Yorkshire, who did a successful community share issue to raise their mortgage deposit, if you like, to add to the debt finance to buy their local pub. They bought it about a year ago. It's trading successfully. They've added a shop and a lending library to their activities since they started. And I thought you might like a picture of the snow as it's on its way. So another stage of stages of growth. My curves aren't quite as wiggly as Ingrid's, and I think she actually had a much better slide, but we're covering some of the same territory there. I should have acknowledged in terms of this slide has been produced by Venturesome, which is one of the active social investors in the community in UK, and has been very influential in terms of this very important thing of building a shared language. So both in terms of the right kind of money for the right stage of growth and understanding the wiggly curve of the growth cycle of business models, I think is extremely important. My focus really with Key Fund has been at that very early stage of growth. Key Fund was put together in South Yorkshire, very reliant on the mining industry, and of course the mining industry, for good or for ill, was more or less destroyed by the Thatcher government in the UK. So very traditional communities in very traditional business models, the coal mining industry, that have been active for 100 to 120 years in South Yorkshire, more or less wiped out as a stroke. As a consequence of that, average incomes in South Yorkshire fell to below 75% of the European Union average, and therefore South Yorkshire became eligible for the highest intensification of EU regional development funding. And Key Fund was founded in order to allow the third sector to access some of the incoming European funding. And we had a long debate about the role of the social economy in the reinvention, never mind the regeneration, of South Yorkshire, and won some of the battles. Very modest amounts to begin with. European money always comes, it will only ever pay for 50% of any particular scheme. So you're always scrabbling around for match funding. And there was a very good woman in the regional government office who went around South Yorkshire beating up the local authorities saying, you will provide match funding for this Key Fund. And that's how we started. We started by giving away money. We gave away £10,000 grants. And then we started to think that there must be a better way. So we started very gently experimenting with packages of grants and loans. And that broadly has been a pattern for a lot of the social investment across the UK. Sue told me not to say this, but I think in some ways we bribed people in the beginning to borrow money. We had a £30,000 package, which we reckon really covered the cost of a key individual for about a year, so that's why it was pitched at that level. And we offered £20,000 grant and £10,000 loan. Very gradually, people understood that if they were really on top of their business model, that they could actually live with loan finance. And over the years, we've changed that. So now our packages that people still take up offer £5,000 grant and £25,000 loan on softish terms, and we don't price for risk because we're operating in that space again where the costs of doing nothing to the state are greater than using intelligently, we hope, some risk money to try and create enterprise. So we've not aimed at sustainability in the narrow sense of covering our costs, but we do justify effectively our free capital from Europe and from the UK government in terms of our social impact. The costs of keeping somebody unemployed and the knock-on effects of unemployment, the underperformance of children in school from unemployed families and that kind of thing, are these long-term costs that come back to haunt us. Just a little Bradford story. Manningham Mills, a former textile mill, very beautiful building, derelict in the heart of the community, had listed building status, so it meant that nobody could knock it down. We had to do something with this. This building is massive. Think 10 football fields. You can only see about a third of it in this particular picture. It only took us 15 years from when we set up the community association that lobbied for its regeneration. We opened in 2005. I've just closed their figures for the last year. We turned over £230,000, providing a range of services, catering, room hire, backed into a project to take people on probation for community payback work, £7,000 in grant, and a £10,000 profit after depreciation on that business. The thing I'm really proud about is that it paid wages to 13 people in March, albeit many of them part-time, and we reckon that our volunteer engagement's running at about 20 a month. Social investment business then came out of a venture capital fund, which is also part of my personal experience, and has turned into a much bigger fund. And on reflection, thinking about the development of the social investment market in the UK, we have had incredibly good support from government. So the social investment business has received, over the last 10 years, about £430 million in free capital, split between a number of these different funds. So Communitybuilders was all about asset building, and offering packages of 40% grant and 60% loan up to £2 million. Not quite enough for me. I worry that social enterprises borrow too much money. Most of us are engaged in people services, which have high people costs. 85% classically of costs are attached to staff and people. That leaves a small gross margin of 15% to pick up everything else. Small gross margins mean low gearing, low borrowing compared to turnover. Social Enterprise Investment Fund was particularly targeted in the early 90s with a very high migrant Pakistani community. Unemployment was running at 45%. Job creation and bringing jobs to Manningham was really important. Developed by ABL, a not-for-profit development trust, has been operating since 1995 with no grant funding at all. Turns over about £1 million. 400 people work from that building. 40,000 people a year come through it. Long-term, resilient organisations. I need to say a little bit about the debt-equity balance. I'm going to whip through these because I presented in the workshop and there's a longer series of it. But we've been looking at community shares, the idea of grouping people and trying to bottle their passion, and instead of asking them to give money, making them an investment proposition. It was backed by government again. We picked 10 organisations, perhaps not the easiest 10 to work with. We were trying to take them all through to share offer stage, and in practice over the 2 years, 1, 2, 3, only 4 of them have got to offer stage at the moment. But outside of our immediate work, we've been trying to change public attitudes, and to some extent, opportunity out of adversity. I think the financial crisis has made us all very dubious about investing in the conventional markets. And there is, I believe, a real appetite for people investing in things that they believe in and can see. And of course, people can afford to invest more than they can afford to donate. So in spite of our track record with our 10s, we've seen a healthy growth in the share market over the last couple of years. And I got the stats for the first quarter. There have been 18 new registrations in the first quarter in the UK. some indication of the spread of that. Sorry, I'm getting flushed out saying I'm talking too much, so I'm going to whiz through some of these. I just want to linger a little bit on this. I think that there's real power in the engaged investor, engaged business model that is proving more resilient. There are 514, I think, community-owned shops that have been bought by local people over the last 10 years, and only 4 of those have gone bust at a time where rural shops have been going bust all over the place. So there does seem to me something where you can bottle people's passion and engage them on a number of different levels. It seems to produce a more resilient business model. Just a little bit, and perhaps I'll end on this then, is the... no, I can't, because Anne-Marie will kill me. So a little bit about the social finance timeline. You'll see that there's quite an ecology now of organisations across the UK providing a range of different services, going back to 2001. And in that space, there are people now who cover most of the spectrum, although there is still a problem with early stage risk capital as far as I'm concerned across the UK. Most of this has been done with heavy government and European support in terms of providing initial capital to the social finance world. Social impact bonds, I'm sorry, I'm not going to have time to cover, too complicated, but it is, I'm not sure if it's shonky or not yet, but social finance is very vulnerable to shonky operators. And there's some people who are coming now out of the mainstream market who are trying to create complicated devices. I really like, I encourage people to keep it as simple as possible. There are only 3 kinds of money. You need the right money for those different stages of your development. Been some very latest thinking. Obviously, this PowerPoint will remain behind. In preparation for the Big Society Bank, there's lots of things on the horizon. I don't know how much of all this work is going to move towards the web and how much crowdfunding. I was talking about this with some people last night. I think I'm too old to understand where the web-based revolution is going to take us. I was a late adopter to email. I've just started to Twitter.
And he's been twittering on the conference.
Yeah. Just something, I'm sure you've all heard about the Big Society Bank in the UK. It is based on taking the unclaimed assets sitting in the commercial banking system, out of that system. The initial amount that they're targeting is £60 million. They've bashed the commercial banks over the head. At least 2 of them are now substantially owned, of course, by the British public following the bailout, to provide some match funding on commercial terms. We wait to see what those terms are. And it will be a wholesaler, so it will provide money to the community development finance institutions. Key Fund now has a £12 million base capital. I went to see the guys and I said, I want 12 million to match what I've got. So living in expectation. Just finally, this is for Anne-Marie. We are thinking about how stuff moves to the web, and she and others have created this thing called PlayStation. It's a site where we're hoping that the whole of the public sector will put its surplus land and buildings. For many years in the property boom, the third sector was knocking on the door saying, give us a building, and the local authorities were saying, no, we want to flood them to plug holes in our budgets. Since the crash and the big cuts, we've now got the public sector saying, you want 20 libraries? You want 20 swimming pools? Take them off us. And we're saying, thanks, you can keep your own liabilities unless we have some profitable balancing assets to come along with them. But PlayStation, do go online and have a look at it. It's a second generation, so it's an engaging thing where people who are looking for buildings can post ideas, and eventually we hope that the professionals who you need, the surveyors and that kind of thing will support it, and it may be a way of at least identifying where the social finances come from. So, sorry, very scrambled, and I didn't manage to cover half the territory I wanted to, but I know I must end now. There's some contact details, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you to the locality conference, which will be in Manchester in the north of England on the 1st and 2nd of November this year. Thank you very much. So I want to plunge into community shares, which has been my passion for the last couple of years. Some of you may have been to the social lending workshop this morning and beginning to get your heads around the use of debt finance to develop social enterprise. I do a lot of talking in the UK about what I call investment readiness, and part of the language we're trying to develop in the UK is that the third sector doesn't get funding, it doesn't get finance. Actually, what it needs is investment. And so we've been trying to promote that kind of language, and I do therefore quite a lot of talking to groups and individuals about getting investment ready. And I talk about the use of debt finance, and I say, get it right, go further faster, get it wrong, crash and burn. There are limitations to the use of debt finance. And having overloaded, to my shame, a number of third sector organisations with debt over the last 10 years and watched them crash and burn, I began to turn my thinking to how can we reduce the risk. As a sector, I think that we are generally undercapitalised, and therefore access to risk capital is really important. I got the opportunity a few years now, 3 years back, talking to friends in government to lead an action learning research programme into community shares, community equity. And what I really want to talk about is what I've learned over the last 2 years or so. So I hope that's okay. I'm going to talk for, I don't know how long. Once I get started, I tend to run on a bit. But I hope not the whole time, and I hope we'll really engage once I've finished. I'm afraid I just don't know enough about the picture here in New Zealand, the legal structures and that kind of thing. But I believe that some of the fundamental principles are important, and I think what will be interesting is how transferable you collectively feel that some of these ideas might be. Okay, so where do I do this? So the Community Shares programme was what I always like to call things an action learning research programme. That really means that you don't know what you're going to end up with at the beginning, and it's a chance to experiment with things. Sorry, can you all see? And we selected 10 organisations who had the right or were interested in developing the right kind of legal shape in order to issue community shares. And we picked a range, not necessarily of the easiest organisations to work with, but I think you get a flavour of the kind of range of organisations who've been looking at this technique of raising risk finance. FC United were the fans of Manchester United who broke away from Manchester United when they were taken over by the horrible Glazier brothers who did a leverage buyout. They loaded huge amounts of debt onto the club, and some fans were disgusted by this and broke away and founded FC United, which is a fan-owned football club. As is the greatest football club in the world, Barcelona, is owned by its fans. So there is an impeccable pedigree in the sports world of fans. And you can clearly see that there is something that generates a huge passion that you can perhaps turn into a business model. Cybermore, a community up in Cumbria in the north of England. Oh, sorry, I just need to deal with this little thing about Scotland here. Just before I came out here, I was invited by my Scottish colleagues to go and make a presentation about community shares. So sometimes they welcome people with, well, I have an English passport, or British passport anyway. Cybermore is a rural community, poor access to broadband services, have already put in a telephone-based system, but are interested in upgrading to optic fibre in order to improve the services in that community. Hastings Pier and White Rock Trust, for instance. Hastings is on the south coast of England. Many of you may know your history of the Norman invasion at Hastings. A very poor community. A lot of our seaside communities in England, because the weather's so shit, basically, and Ryanair and EasyJet have come in, so everyone wants to go to the sun, have really suffered and have become dumping grounds. So very low property values, places that people have migrated to. So although it sounds very nice, actually this is a very poor community with a derelict pier that was owned by some shady Panamanian registered private sector company that had failed to comply with some health and safety legislation, injunctions a few years back, and had disappeared off the face of the earth. The people interested in regenerating Hastings thought that regenerating the pier would be key to this. So a whole range of problems, a lot of interest from renewable energy, local renewable energy schemes. You can see the range there. And shops, sorry, I should mention shops and pubs have been a real growth area for this kind of thing. In rural communities, the last shop in the village closing, inevitably impacting the poorer members of that community, people without access to cars, people living on fixed income and that kind of thing. But also more than just losing the shop, you also lose one of the cores of social capital in that community. Everyone knows how much gossip there is to be got in the village shop. So, the challenge really was to move from fundraising to investment, and recognising that some services in the community are best delivered through a business model. And I have to say, I need to be clear, this only works if there is a fundamentally viable business model underneath the idea here, although there is some emerging evidence that actually the resultant business model is in some ways more resilient, and I'll come on to that. And these things, I think, Steve Lawrence was talking about many of these things. Businesses can be run for social purpose and not for private profit. And this shift that I've been talking about, and I hope I've made a small contribution to, in changing the mindset from the sort of handout culture, gimme, 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 to actually going to people with serious investment propositions, and leading, of course, to greater autonomy for communities. Changing public attitudes also, most people can afford to invest more money than they can afford to give. I mean, just it's simply the case. And so, particularly, I think, in the current zeitgeist, and again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but we've seen what the casino does to our savings, and we know that sooner or later we'll get a letter through the post that said, sorry, we told you were going to get so much, and sorry, things have changed, you're going to get much less. So, I mean, I think we were opportunity out of adversity in a way. The crash of 2007, I think, made people think much more about where their savings were, what their savings were doing. They were horrified to find what some of the banks have been up and savings institutions have been up to with their savings, and beginning to think more carefully about their personal, both their personal consumption patterns, but also their personal savings patterns and personal investment patterns. And we were trying to capitalize on that. And also to shift from the philanthropic, I don't like the please, please, please charity model too much. I have problems with it, but I like the idea of an investment proposition. So we started, I love this graph. We started in the back end of, right at the end of 2008. I need to explain perhaps some of the annotations there. KICs are community interest companies, which are a fairly new form of legal structure introduced in the early 2000s. There are two forms, the company limited by guarantee model and the company limited by shares. PLC is the private limited company, so private companies. The IPS stands for Industrial and Provident Society, and it is a wonderful old 19th century legal form that has some special features. And you can see the increasing interest in this particular IPS structure. Industrial and Provident Societies can either be cooperatives, pure cooperatives, so employee-owned cooperatives, or for the benefit of the community. And it's particularly the latter form that was important to us. Raising money from the general public is rightly a hugely regulated activity. Over the years, more and more legislation has been put in place. And as a consequence, if you want to raise substantial funds from the general public, it is a very, very expensive and heavily regulated process. You need very expensive lawyers who write prospectuses as thick as a telephone directory, and estimates are, anything from £60,000 to £100,000. Sorry, do I have to double up for New Zealand dollars? Something like that. So if you want to raise modest amounts of money, clearly not practical. The Industrial and Provident Society have an exemption from the Key Act, which is the Financial Services Market Act of 2006, that they are allowed to raise money because they are raising money for social purpose. And there are special conditions attached to that. But it was a glitch, if you like, a glitch, if you like, in the regulations that we were able to point out was possible, at least. And the obligations of an Industrial and Provident Society is that they should register with the Financial Services Authority, but are not regulated by it. So these are unregulated public offerings for share capital. So just a bit more about historically where these things have fallen. Renewable energy, a lot of community-owned wind, many hydro schemes have been developed using this particular legal form. Quite a lot in terms of regeneration of land and buildings, assets. I completely agree again with stuff that was said this morning. The development trust movement, for which I've been working for many years, says get your hands on land and buildings, get an enterprising model, get independent from government, get a different kind of quality of income stream. Consumer co-ops, consumer retail stores. Actually, there's been an explosion of community-owned shops in the UK. Not many of them, stupidly in my view, but it was partly because there was a particularly benign grant regime that actually said if the community raised a certain amount of money, then they could get the equivalent in grant and a guaranteed loan for the same amount. And actually, buying out your local village shop, if you're not necessarily buying the building along with it, isn't a hugely expensive proposition. So a lot of them got through without needing to do a community share issue, Most of them now, that grant regime has disappeared, are raising the community part of the investment through share offers. Transport, historic railways, this is, perhaps a bit English, but there are a load of people who are absolutely nuts about old steam trains. And it's that kind of community of passion for which this really works. I was talking to someone, the guy who works with Prometheus, I've forgotten his name, is he here? Dave Farah? He was talking about some financing that they'd done for a wetland project, a group of people wanting to restore wetland here in New Zealand. And he said, they are so committed. They feel that if this project doesn't work, species will die out and that kind of thing. That kind of passion for, as an investor, is something that is really investable in. And this is about trying to bottle that passion. At the bottom you see pubs. Well, I don't need to explain why pubs engender passion, particularly in rural communities. The first one actually was a microbrewery project that then the pub in the village became available, and they bought the pub as well with a share issue. And we're now seeing that replicated all over the place. And football, again, is of growing interest. So, special things to do with industrial and provident societies. Firstly, the shares are not transferable. If you think about investing in normal shares in the share market, people invest, the shares are tradable on the stock exchange, so you can buy and sell them whenever you want, in theory, although in practice, with small companies, often the market is very illiquid and you can't get rid of your shares very easily. But in big public companies, usually you can. And you're investing both for dividend, and most often people are investing actually for that whoosh, that capital uplift. They hope that, their energy company is going to strike oil and that their 2p share is suddenly going to be worth, £2, and that there'll be a massive capital gain. So these shares aren't tradable, they're not transferable. The only way you can redeem them is by getting the company to buy them back from you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a very democratic structure. So it's one member, one vote. And if you buy a £5 share, you are a member. If you invest £20,000, and that actually technically is the limit for any individual investing in these schemes, you still only get one vote. So that actually, if you think about it, that means that it is very difficult for any one individual to steer that company. There isn't that financial self-interest. Upper limit on individual member investment. The interest, the dividend that is payable on the share capital is limited by law to the amount that is necessary to attract the investment. That's a bit sort of mealy-mouthed phrase, but effectively it means you can't pay huge dividends. And there is a statutory asset lock, which means that whatever capital asset that is purchased, say if you're doing a community pub and you raise the share capital to buy the pub, that capital asset must remain forever in line with mission. So there is no possibility of the big capital uplift. Now this blows some people's minds. They just can't understand. Why would you do that? Well, the answer is because it takes that particular service or something out of the speculative world. So if it is of genuine long-term community interest in order to do this, these mechanisms together effectively insulate it from the casino capitalism. Okay. Is it the right option? Well, it depends. I mean, it clearly is a more complicated thing to do than some other things. But clearly it also makes sense for people who find a common passion. about 40% of the Western Isles in Scotland are now in community ownership, and some of them have used, there was a very benign European-backed grant scheme that allowed the communities to come together and buy their islands. But a lot of the enterprises that they've subsequently done, a lot of them have done renewable energy schemes, a lot of them have bought out the ferry company that takes people to and from the islands, local shops, local hotels, many of them have taken over the big house to turn it into some kind of hotel, receptions, tourist venue, have used community shares in order to do this. All these things are long-term propositions, and very often with the offer document, part of getting that right is to say to people, you can't have your money back for the first 3 years, and for the first 3 years we won't pay a dividend at all. But once it's established, once the wind turbine's up and running, then maybe there will be a dividend for you. But that will be a post-balance sheet event. It's not like a loan where you know that on the 6th of December you've got to pay your 11% or your 5% or whatever it is. You get to the end of the year, you see how you do, and then at the discretion of the directors, democratically elected, you decide how much you can afford to pay out. So it is, in that sense, genuine risk capital. The key elements we think we've learned is, obviously it starts in some senses with the business model. The governing document, societies don't have memorandum and articles of association like companies, they have rules, and some of the language around this 19th century legal form is quite quaint. But societies have rules, but they perform exactly the same function. They describe what the company's going to do and how it's going to operate. And importantly, they incorporate an asset lock and that kind of thing. There is then obviously a community building process, and certainly some of the longer term things, I think of the Hastings Pier mob, for instance, have got a fabulous Facebook page. And they use Facebook very successfully. I think they have 3,000 friends on Facebook, and they've used that as a cheap communication method, but also a way of community building and preparing the community to be ready for the final piece of the equation, I suppose, which is an offer document. Now, this exemption from the Financial Market Services Act means that the offer document can be written by anybody. And we've tried to produce, as part of our programme, some tools to help people produce decent offer documents so that they should be transparent and describe the business model properly, provide further access to information if people want it. And clearly they need to be truthful documents. What did Steve Lawrence talk about? Shonky operators, was it? I'm not quite sure what shonky means. But clearly this market, is very vulnerable to what I would call sheep in wolf's clothing. People who want to, oh, there's a good trick to raise a load of cash. And there have been, again, in Connell's neck of the woods, there was a very public crash of an organisation backed by the church called the Presbyterian Mutual Society that actually had very poor governance and was backed by the church, though, so everyone thought, well, that must be okay. And people put their money in. It didn't really have a proper social purpose. It turned into a sort of savings and loans institution and ploughed into the Irish property market, which sadly has been one of the huge victims of the casino crash. So the importance of a probity of an offer document is there. And we're talking to government about perhaps trying to develop what we're calling a co-regulatory system whereby the sector would be self-regulating but with the backing, and we hope the resources of government, we hope we've persuaded them that it's cheaper if we help them regulate it than if they try and regulate it themselves. The jury's out, quite frankly. The Treasury were appalled by the collapse of the Presbyterian Mutual. In the end, for political expediency, they were forced, although they didn't have any obligation, to bail out the investors in that. So it cost them money. We are fighting an ongoing battle with the Treasury so that this market isn't regulated out of existence. We are perceived, however, as very big society. And clearly government doesn't have any money in the UK, or says it doesn't, to do anything. And so they're very interested in anything that promotes community resilience that doesn't cost them, and they see this as an opportunity. These kind of businesses tend to have multiple member engagement. So not only do people come in as potentially as investors, but if you think of perhaps the simplest one is the village shop model. So a village community gets together, the richer folk put in their 20 grand, the widows living on fixed income put in their £100, but actually it's more valuable to them perhaps than it is to the guy with the Range Rover who can drive to the nearest supermarket.